Buckeye Talk back at Ohio State today. I'm Nathan Baird from cleveland.com along with Stephen Means and Doug Lesmerises. We just talked to Ryan Day, his usual Tuesday pre-game press conference leading into Indiana this weekend. We also got some assistant coaches who we hadn't talked to since preseason camp, and that was linebackers coach Al Washington and offensive line coach Greg Studrawa. And I wanted to start there because I thought he gave us some really interesting insight into some of the dynamics that are playing out in the room. And Matt Jones, for people who haven't been paying attention, he's been subbing into games a lot. He's played some left guard, some right guard. Greg Studrawa today called him the backup center. You go to look at Pro Football Focus, he's graded out as one of the best offensive linemen in the country, period. I think he might be number one among interior offensive linemen. So it's been a really great season for him in a sort of a backup role. And all these Ohio State coaches are kind of praising him for that. But at the same time, he doesn't really have a starting role. And Greg Studrawa was asked today, would he ever force the hand here a little bit? And his answer was, absolutely, that would be a really difficult thing to do. Which to me was like, he's playing as well as a starter, but do you want to shake things up? Doug, just kind of what did you take away from that? And do you think it's worth considering Ohio State, if that turns out to be the best five guys, do they have to make that call?
So the way he talked about Matthew Jones, it felt like to me, if Matthew Jones was doing this in the preseason, maybe they wouldn't have ever reshuffled the offensive line. Because he sort of was saying Matthew Jones realized how hard you have to work and study to do all this kind of stuff. And that's a credit to Matthew Jones for doing that. When they talked about it in the preseason and they did the shift that brought DeJuan Jones in kind of as a surprising starter at that point, they said DeJuan Jones forced us to do this. And now they're kind of saying Matthew Jones is forcing us to play him. So I don't know exactly what it would be that their best five would include Matthew Jones, because I understand they're talking about now, listen, Thayer Munford's had some physical issues. He said Paris Johnson has been dinged up a little bit. To sub in Matthew Jones and get him reps with the ones at guard helps keeps Munford and Johnson fresh. If they did something, would it be going back to the original thing and Petit Frere goes back to right tackle and Munford goes to left tackle and DeJuan Jones is out? They're not going to bench Thayer, They're not going to not make Thayer Munford a starter if he's healthy. Would it be Paris Johnson? I mean, Matthew Jones is the backup center, they said, but I don't think it's Luke Whitler. I guess I'm curious. I'm not intrigued because I think their line's good. It's great to have six guys you trust. If they did something, I don't even know what it would be. What would it be?
I think that would be what it would be. I think it would be that DeJuan Jones would get expelled. But the thing is, you go look at those same ratings from Pro Football Focus, he's like one of the 10 best tackles in the country. So they have a good problem right now. One of the pieces of insight I thought we got today was he was asked about Luke Whitler, and especially because of the situation with Harry Miller, who's been out for most of the year, has not really played, is only finally just starting to mix his way back in. And Greg Studrawa called Matt Jones the backup center, but said that it was like 10 days before the year that they decided to make that Harry Miller should start over Luke Whitler, which kind of testified to how confident they were in Luke Whitler. And Stephen, I think you were someone who, just because you'd followed it through the recruiting process, that sort of reinforces, I think, where you sort of expected Luke Whitler to maybe have been at this stage of his career.
Yeah, Harry Miller was the starting center, and then he got hurt, so Luke Whitler was the starting center, and then it became a question of how many weeks can Luke Whitler play well along with Harry Miller not practicing before you just have to give Luke the job and not worry about it because he's playing so well. Greg Studrawa didn't really give me a number or a date. It just seemed he just said I've always felt comfortable with either option, which understandably, yes, Luke Whitler was a borderline top 100 recruit, and for a center, that's a pretty big deal. Harry Miller was a 5-star recruit, which is a pretty big deal when you're a center, so that's a good problem to have again. But yeah, it reached a point, I think, where you were comfortable with either option, but because Harry had a little bit more experience there, you wanted to play him. He got hurt. Luke's out there. He played well. You can't really take him off the field, especially, as he said today, it doesn't seem like Harry Miller is still 100% healthy. If he's not even practicing with the ones and twos right now, they're still easing him back into things.
I think Harry Miller's like a better athlete, probably. Luke Whitler, I think, is like the classic grinder that you see at center sometimes, where Harry Miller, I think, has flexibility throughout the line. It just feels like it might just be a lost year for Harry Miller. And, they're just going to keep this, get Harry Miller back healthy, and, next year, Thayer Munford's going to be gone, Nicholas Petit Frere's going to be gone, Paris Johnson's going to be back out at tackle, and there'll be plenty of room for Harry Miller to take a starting spot again. If the guy's not even able to practice for a full week halfway through the season, it just might be, get healthy, but, don't even worry about it. You don't worry about it. We won't worry about it. Get ready to start in 2022.
And I believe he's only played in 2 games so far, and we don't know what opportunities there'll be to play in games later. So this might end up even being a year that won't hurt him eligibility-wise.
I mean, nobody redshirts anymore. Harry Miller's a 5-star. He's not going to be here for 6 years. He has the year from, like, everything's fake. So I don't think it's a redshirt conversation. It's just let's not force it if we're okay.
Yeah, just pointing out, but just from an eligibility standpoint, it was something that wouldn't cost him either, though I agree with what you're saying. That he's not a guy who's going to be here for taking those super senior years, most likely. It was interesting you mentioned about the Matt Jones situation, about how he kind of had to buy into things, because the other guy who had to buy into things was DeJuan Jones. I asked Greg Studrawa today, like, at what point in the recruiting process did DeJuan Jones convince you guys that he was ready to play football? And he said, about a year after he got here. And then he said it wasn't until this past spring. And I think that it's interesting timing how that sort of worked out, that if the light hadn't gone on for DeJuan Jones, where would this offensive line be right now? But at the same time, we talked before the year that this might be, I don't know if it's going to be the best line in the country, but I'm struggling to think of what offensive line is deeper than this, because you can look across here and how many different spots has a guy now already started. I mean, maybe only 2 at the tackles, but all 3 of the interior spots, you could say that you probably have 3 starter-worthy guys who could play for this team and who you wouldn't, one injury might not be catastrophic for this line.
Yeah, I agree with that. They have 3 versions of this line that you could throw out there and say this is the best line in the country, which Bama may be able to do that, but they're also starting a true freshman at right tackle right now who should be on Ohio State's roster, in J.C. Latham. But so, yeah, maybe from that standpoint, but I also just think that, yes, Matt Jones has played well. Maybe we're thinking too deep into this, because I asked Ryan Day about it a couple of weeks ago. Maybe it's just there, Mumford was dinged up, Paris Johnson was dinged up, and you were playing opponents you were going to beat by 30. You can rotate and do some of those things, but now that you're getting ready to hit this gauntlet here with a bunch of top 10 opponents, they're going to settle in on a group and just be fine with whatever that group is.
Yeah, I mean, somebody's got to be the 6th best offensive lineman for this team, and right now that looks like Matt Jones, and but he's getting opportunities to play at least these last few weeks, and we'll see what plays out over the second half, because these last couple weeks there were obviously blowouts and they could play with things a little bit more. This going in, Greg Studrawa even said, everybody talks about rotating the offensive line, but he wants 5 guys to go out there and just be the line and do the job, and I think that's what we're probably going to settle into here in the second half as the bees swarm us here. So get the text, 614-350-3315, so we can afford some insect repellent and keep bringing you these videos every day throughout the week from Buckeye Talk.